Imagine discovering a murder victim in an isolated cabin with a knife buried deep in his back. Now imagine discovering that the exact same knife had been locked inside a secure police vault for 5 long years. How did it get there? Welcome to Hidden Reality. Today we are examining two historical cases that completely shatter our understanding of logic. We have two bodies, and we have two completely impossible explanations.
In this explainer, we are going to dive deep into two macabre mysteries from the late 19th century. We will examine the primary evidence from the source material to reconstruct exactly what happened. These are cases where the physical evidence is so bizarre, so inexplicably terrifying, that the investigators at the time were forced to question reality itself. Our first story takes us to a quiet, affluent neighborhood in Guanajuato, Mexico. The year is 1890.
Tadeo Mejia was a wealthy, highly successful engineer. He had just purchased a sprawling, beautiful home for his new bride, Maria. One evening, a terrible fever left Tadeo confined to his bed. Maria decided to walk out and visit her family alone. Just a few hours later, Tadeo was jolted awake by frantic knocking at his door. The police led him out into the cold night air to a nearby alleyway. There, Maria lay dead. She had been stabbed in the back. Her handbag and personal belongings were gone. To the police, it looked like a tragic random robbery, but for Tadeo, it was the beginning of a nightmare.
Tadeo's world shattered. He stumbled back home, collapsing in total shock. As night fell, his fever spiked, bringing on severe hallucinations. He dreamt Maria was outside his window, stumbling down the street, trailing blood and screaming for his help. He would wake up drenched in sweat, but the nightmare wouldn't stop. He could still hear her voice echoing in the distance, calling his name. Over the next few weeks, unbearable grief and guilt completely consumed him. Tadeo became absolutely convinced that the voice he heard wasn't just his imagination, it was Maria's spirit, and she was refusing to rest until her killer was punished. Frustrated by the police, Tadeo launched his own desperate, obsessive investigation. But while he was hitting dead end after dead end, a sudden, sinister pattern emerged in Guanajuato. A local drifter disappeared without a trace. A week later, a woman living on the outskirts of town vanished. Then, a third person, a local man, went missing. Panic gripped the town. The people began to whisper. There was a serial killer on the loose. Tadeo's hunt for his wife's killer seemed hopeless. Until one day, something shifted. What could possibly make a grieving husband grip a loaded pistol, walk up to a sprawling, expensive home, and turn the handle? He was terrified. But as he stepped inside and moved slowly toward the basement stairs, he was absolutely certain that the answer to his wife's murder was waiting down there in the dark. Moments later, a neighbor heard a single, deafening gunshot and immediately called the police. When officers rushed down into the basement of that home, they stepped into a scene straight out of a nightmare. Illuminated by flickering candlelight were the mangled bodies of the three missing townspeople. Opposite the bodies stood a dark, occult altar. On it lay a long knife, a spellbook, and a chalice filled with human blood. Painted on the wall behind it all was a massive, bloody red pentagram. But here is the most chilling twist of all. That sprawling, expensive home, it was Tadeo's own house. Tadeo was the serial killer. In his absolute desperation to find his wife's murderer, he had sought out a local witch. She gave him a dark ritual, one that required human blood to tear the veil between the living and the dead. Tadeo kidnapped and slaughtered the drifter, the woman, and the local man, performing the ritual over and over. When Maria's spirit still didn't appear, the witch told him there was only one path left. He had to become the sacrifice himself. The gunshot the neighbor heard was Tadeo taking his own life at that altar. He became a monster, trying to solve a murder that was, in the end, just a random robbery. It is a haunting example of how extreme grief can fracture reality. But our second story shifts from the heat of Mexico into the brutal, freezing snow of South Dakota. The year is 1899. A massive, unexpected blizzard strikes. Two cowboys, Charles Casmer and Frank Hayapa, get separated from their ranch crew. Charles is terrified, but his fear has nothing to do with the freezing temperatures. He is terrified because he is trapped alone with Frank. 5 years earlier, Frank was charged with brutally murdering his business partner, stabbing him in the back. Frank somehow avoided prison by claiming self-defense, a claim everyone knew was practically impossible given the wound. Charles had spent years avoiding this man. Now, completely lost in a whiteout, he had no choice but to follow Frank, who miraculously manages to find a small, abandoned shack in the blinding dark. Inside, the two men huddle by a fire. Charles, trying to break the heavy tension, mentions how incredibly lucky they were to stumble upon this abandoned place. Frank doesn't even look up. He casually stirs a can of beans and replies, "No, luck had nothing to do with it. I used to live here." Charles freezes. He looks at the thick layer of dust covering everything in the room. The blood drains from his face. This wasn't just any shack. This was the exact shack where Frank had murdered his partner 5 years ago.
Pure panic takes over. Charles mumbles an excuse about needing fresh air, grabs his coat, and practically runs out into the raging storm. He prefers the deadly blizzard over sharing a room with a murderer. But as he stands out in the snow next to their horses, something impossible happens. A dark shadow moves violently across the illuminated cabin window. Then, the sounds of a brutal, terrifying struggle echo from inside. Charles knows for a fact that Frank is the only living soul in that cabin. Overcome by a sudden morbid curiosity, he cautiously creeps back to the door, pulls it open, and steps inside.
The scene before him is an impossible loop in time. 5 years ago, Frank's business partner was found dead in this exact room, face down near the fireplace, stabbed in the back. Now, in the present day, Charles stares at Frank Hipa himself. Frank is dead, he is face down near the fireplace, and a knife is plunged deeply into his back. The scene is utterly identical to the murder 5 years prior, but there is no one else in the cabin.
Charles completely loses his mind. He jumps on his horse and flees blindly into the blizzard. By sheer luck, local ranchers find him the next morning, half frozen and suffering from severe shock. Once he can speak, he begs them to follow him back to the shack. The ranchers remember this place perfectly. They were the ones who cleaned up the original murder scene 5 years ago. When they walk in and see Frank dead, exactly like his old partner, they immediately draw their weapons on Charles. He was the only one out there with Frank, so they tie him up and arrest him for murder.
Fast forward to June 1899. The grand jury convenes. Journalists flock to the courthouse. Everyone assumes Charles will simply plead self-defense. After all, he was trapped with a known killer. It is the only logical defense available. But Charles doesn't claim self-defense. He looks the jury dead in the eyes and delivers what might be the most absurd legal defense in history. He recounts the shadow in the window. He describes the violent sounds of the struggle. And then he firmly states that he didn't kill Frank Hipa. He claims that the restless ghost of Frank's murdered partner had returned to that cabin to exact his revenge. You would fully expect a grand jury of hardened ranchers to laugh him out of the room. A ghost defense? It is ridiculous. But there was one physical detail at the crime scene that shattered their logic. One singular, impossible piece of evidence. And it revolves around the number 5. The knife protruding from Frank's back was not just a random weapon. It was the exact same knife Frank had used to kill his partner 5 years ago. Here is the impossible problem. After that original murder, the police had confiscated the knife and locked it inside a heavy steel evidence safe in town. But the night before Frank's trial, the knife inexplicably vanished from that locked vault. No one knew how. It had been missing for 5 full years, and now it had suddenly reappeared, buried in Frank's back in the middle of a blinding blizzard. Charles had zero connection to Frank 5 years ago. He had absolutely no way of accessing a locked police safe. The grand jury was entirely paralyzed. Charles could not have physically possessed that specific weapon. The physical evidence completely defied reality. So, in one of the most shocking legal decisions on record, the grand jury dropped all charges. Charles walked free. The decision is wild enough, but the official legal reasoning cements this case into legend. Unable to rationally explain how a murder weapon teleported from a locked police safe into a dead man's back half a decade later, the grand jury legally accepted Charles's supernatural defense. Their actual official conclusion? Yep, a ghost did it. Legally, they ruled that the murdered partner's spirit stole the knife from the safe, waited 5 years, and finally took his identical revenge. We are left with a fascinating dilemma at the end of this explainer. Tadeo Mejia turned himself into a monster chasing spirits that weren't there. Yet a South Dakota grand jury let a murder suspect walk free because the physical evidence suggested a spirit truly was there. When logic utterly fails and the evidence in front of you defies the laws of physics, are we forced to believe the impossible? Think about how you would have voted on that jury. If you enjoy uncovering hidden truths, subscribe to Hidden Reality and join us for more incredible true stories and hidden realities from around the world.